Good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to have you join us for today's webinar titled Breaking Barriers to Literacy Across the Lifespan, Perspectives from Audiology, Education, Optometry, and Speech-Language Pathology. I'm Miriam Levy. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Public Health, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today and introduce our panelists. First is Anasa Franklin. Ms. Franklin is Director of Community Impact for Literacy Mid-South. She's worked as an educator, community advocate, and leader in the educational and nonprofit sector throughout the Memphis community. Next is Katherine Mendez, clinical instructor in speech-language pathology at the University of Memphis in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. A bilingual speech-language pathologist, she specializes in language, literacy, and executive function. Next is Dr. Deborah Moncrieff. She's assistant professor in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders at the University of Memphis, and she researches the diagnosis and treatment of auditory processing disorders. And last, we have Dr. Melissa Zarn, assistant professor of optometry and director of interprofessional education at the Southern College of Optometry. She provides clinical services to individuals with visual processing disorders. So it's our pleasure to be with you today. We'd like to acknowledge the partnership of the University of Memphis, FedEx Institute of Technology, and Rami Lotte, who's been very gracious in helping us host this seminar, Literacy Mid-South, the University of Memphis School of Communication Sciences and Disorders, and Southern College of Optometry. So before we start, I'd like to say if you could type in your questions, we will hold the questions until the end, and hopefully the last 15 or 20 minutes we'll be able to address them. And we'll start now with Ms. Anasa Franklin.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. When we think about literacy, we typically think about books. And really, literacy is a little bit more than that, right? It's the things that we're reading, it's the things that we're hearing, it's writing, it's communicating with numbers. It's really being able to communicate ideas or express ideas between others, right? And so what we've been thinking about at Literacy Mid-South is just that idea of literacy across the lifespan, because what we've kind of come to realize is that reading, and whether that's in books, whether you're reading blogs, op-eds, Twitter comments, but when you're reading, reading activates a series of things, right? It activates your emotions, it activates thoughts, it activates ideas, and ultimately, eventually, it'll even activate a few behaviors. But what we've also recognized is that in our community, we found some barriers to that. And those barriers primarily fall in two big clumps, right? Those barriers are poverty, and those barriers are some of the ones that we'll discuss specifically around information processing that will inhibit us activating those series of things that will lead us to change lives and enhance lives. What I thought about when we started having the conversation about this webinar is that I have a story. And my story is similar to the story that many of us either heard or we've actually walked this path. And my story is when my son was in pre-K, he was 3 years old, he failed a series of audio tests. And so they tested him twice, and then with the third test, we were told at the front end that if he didn't pass this test, that we will have to, he wouldn't be able to return to school without clearance from an audiologist. And so inevitably, my son took the third assessment and he failed that third assessment. Now, what I didn't know and what I found out after I went through a long series of events was that he was taking the test to test his hearing inside a classroom with 27 arguably other people, including the teacher's assistants and maybe people going in and out. But he failed this test 3 times. And so failed the test the third time, couldn't return back to school. And so what did I do? I didn't know. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where to turn. And I asked the preschool teacher, and the best that she could do was give me a sheet of paper that had a telephone number at the bottom of it, and she circled it. Well, I reached out to the number because It was the number if your child failed this assessment and you need further information, more information. When I reached out to this particular number, I was told that my child had to be screened in a facility. It couldn't happen in a doctor's office. It had to happen in a facility that specialized in hearing screenings. And so even with that, I thought, okay, well, where do I go next? Because there wasn't that, here's what you do next. And so I reached out to my pediatrician. When he said doctor, I said, okay, well, I'll call Dr. Dillinger. Reached out to my pediatrician. And she said, we don't screen, we don't refer specifically without, there was a whole bunch of back and forth, even with my pediatrician. To make the long story short, my pediatrician had to give me a referral after going back to her. And then my son was able to get screened. And wonderful result for my family is that my son actually passed the hearing screening. And the caveat in his particular case was the other 27 kids. But I said all that to say this: the challenges that we faced, were the red tape around not only how was he screened, but what do we do in the event if he passes or fails, or next steps, and who do I reach out to, and this, and this. Because when I went to the audiologist, there was a copay. And not only was there a copay, his screening wasn't covered on the insurance. So it was a $700 bill when I could have, in fact, gone to Colonial hearing screening and visual. And that would have been at no cost to me. And that really boils down to resources. Not only resources, but access to those resources. And at Literacy Mid-South, what we've been able to do over the course of the year, specifically in this pandemic, and thinking about typically the exchange of information happens in our community with paper, or an exchange that's face-to-face. So really thinking about, how do we still put the resources in the hands of our community across the lifespan in a way that not only gives them access, but it gives them access to that quality, those quality resources and those data-enriched, data-backed interventions. Across the lifespan, what you'll see in a moment is that we have resources, early childhood resources, school-age resources. We're currently building out our opportunity youth resources, resources for adult literacy. And our second build out is our adult language learners. And so as we go to the Info Hub, I'll quickly highlight a few that might be helpful in trying to figure out next steps, and trying to find support, and really trying to navigate, how do I best support my child, best support my family member or my community member with the information that I have in the circumstance that we've been presented.
Would you like us to click on the
Yes, please, Mary, if you could click on to the Info Hub link.
Let's see. Can everyone see that?
I don't think they can. In the interest of time, because I did see a notice that might prevent you from being able to see it. Mary, and we were trying to work through security. It doesn't hit everybody. It's only one or two that it's kind of popped up, and it looked like that was the message that I just saw pop up on the screen. So you may be able to get to it, you may not, but in the interest of time, I can absolutely put the link to our Info Hub. And like I said, it is actually secure. Every now and then it, I don't know, I'm not the tech person. Every now and then it triggers that message that Marian just received. And so I'll put the link to our Info Hub inside the chat, and you guys can look at it at your leisure. Thank you for your time. And I'll go back to you, Marian.
Okay.
Okay, Marian, should I, do you want to stop screen share and I share?
Got it.
Wonderful. All right. Okay, let me try that again. We practice this, I promise. All right. Is that looking good? Great. Okay, my name is Katherine Mendez, and I'm a speech language pathologist, and I spend a lot of my time with literacy. I'm going to talk about 3 barriers that I see from my experience that I think are keeping students, individuals in general, from reaching the literacy goals that they want and that we want for them. Uh, the first thing is I just don't think people are entirely aware of the current state of literacy in Tennessee unless you work in this particular field. I just find that people do not realize that we are in a crisis of literacy in the state of Tennessee, and it's even more severe here in Shelby County. In Tennessee in 2019, 35% of fourth graders and 33% of eighth graders performed at or above proficient on the NAEP reading assessment, only 35%. That's not, we know it's possible for almost 95% of children to read proficiently. And we live in the United States of America with so many resources. This doesn't need to be happening. Additionally, Tennessee student achievement data shows that an average of 32.8% of students across grade levels are meeting grade level expectations in English language arts. Again, that's 33%. That's not okay. And I think the thing that doesn't get mentioned as often as it should is that literacy issues, not reading and writing proficiently, have significant negative consequences throughout the lifespan of the individuals that we aren't teaching to read. And additionally, it has negative impacts on our entire community. Folks that have a harder time finding work, folks that end up being incarcerated because of things they end up doing because they don't have access to work. In a lot of ways, and I should mention also health outcomes that are related to difficulty even reading your prescription bottle, all kinds of negative outcomes that as a community, as stakeholders, as taxpayers, these affect us, even if we are the people who happened to be able to read well. So this should be something that we're all invested in. So help me spread the word and we can eliminate that barrier. So the next barrier that I want to talk about is a barrier that's kind of exists between what we know about the science of reading and what the rest of the world knows. In the area of psychology and speech language pathology and neuroscience and audiology, and we know a lot of stuff. We're still struggling to get this information to the people who need it most, which is educators and parents. So this webinar in particular is helping us eliminate that barrier to a certain degree. And the third barrier is that we have instructional practices based on some misconceptions about the neuroscience, about how reading works. So I want to talk about those, both what we know about how reading happens in the brain and which instructional practices we need to take another look at to help maximize our literacy outcomes. So I'm going to talk about 5 common misconceptions. There are more, but these are the ones I find myself talking about a lot. The first is that, and I'm going to go into each one individually, but I'm going to review them real quickly. The first is that learning to read is a natural process. The second is that our brains are somehow wired to learn how to read the same way they're wired to learn how to talk. The third misconception is that in order to learn how to read, people just need exposure to books and print. They need enjoyable shared reading experiences and lots of reading experience. They need authentic texts that are interesting to them, and they need texts that reflect and affirm their identity. I'm not saying that these things are not true. I'm going to talk about what part about that I think is a misconception though. Spelling instruction is unnecessary because kids have spell check. And handwriting instruction is unnecessary because kids will be typing everything. These are things I hear a lot. And so I'm going to talk about what the science actually says about these things. So back to that first idea that learning to read is an instinctual, natural process. 35 years of research has not supported this view. Children do not learn to read the same way they learn to speak. When children learn to speak, we know that just being around speakers who speak to them, it does help activate networks to help them learn how to speak. And there is a misconception that reading is the same, that if a child is just around books and people read to the child, that the child will learn how to read. To the contrary, research has shown that certain aspects of learning to read are highly unnatural. One of the big ones is this idea that a child would, or an adult, would naturally be able to pick apart the individual sounds in the spoken word. That is a task that is specific to reading and did not matter in the world at all until we developed written language based on the alphabetic principle, and until reading and writing was required for all kinds of things in life. So this is the core skill for reading, the ability to hear the individual sounds in words, is an unnatural skill. It's not something we need to do for any purpose other than reading. And in the words of psychologist and researcher Dr. Keith Stanovich, the idea that learning to read is just like learning to speak is accepted by no responsible linguist, psychologist, or cognitive science in the research community. This is really settled science at this point. So moving on, the idea that our brain is wired to learn how to read like it is wired to learn how to talk, as if there is, we know there are language parts of the brain. There's a misconception that there are parts of the brain that are just built, that we're born with parts of the brain that whose purpose is for reading. Now, while human brains are naturally wired to speak, they are not naturally wired to read and write. Reading and writing are acquired skills for which the human brain is not yet fully evolved. We are not born with a reading center of the brain. In order to read, we have to create an interface in our brain between our visual system, and that part of the brain exists for other reasons. We just take advantage of it because it turns out it works really well in most people, for identifying letters. And then, so we take that visual part of the brain, we repurpose it, and then we make connections to the speech and language centers of the brain. That's how we learn to read. We create and construct the part of our brain that we use for reading. Now, there are certain disabilities, specifically I'm thinking of dyslexia, as well as these auditory and visual processing disorders we're going to talk about later, that make this process of repurposing and connecting harder. The brain does not make these changes and connections naturally. They aren't going to spontaneously occur without intention. And what we know is that learning how to read actually changes the brain. It creates the reading center of the brain, which is very cool, in my opinion. So now that we know that reading isn't just a part of the brain that needs to be activated by exposure, that we have to construct it, that can change how we think about instructional practices, right? So the idea that all that kids need in order to learn how to read is exposure, shared reading, interesting and authentic text, and time to read would be true if learning to read was just like learning to talk, right? If we just needed to be exposed and have practice, then these things would be true. However, we know that's not the case. And what we know is that these things I listed are necessary. They are not, we should not get rid of them, but they are not sufficient. Explicit instruction in how the written code works is required. Children have to actively create this interface between the visual and the language system. They have to be explicitly taught how to form letters, how to hear the individual sounds in words and map them onto the letters in written words. That's a process called orthographic mapping, and it's the core of learning how to decode words. Children also have to be explicitly taught the spelling rules and patterns and how morphemes or word parts work and how they impact spelling. They need the opportunity to practice reading and spelling until they become fluent and automatic. But they also need feedback during that time, left to themselves to do these things. If they're not getting feedback that they're doing it correctly or incorrectly, it's not particularly valuable, the time spent. And again, from Dr. Stanovich, that direct instruction in alphabetic coding facilitates early reading acquisition is one of the most well-established conclusions in all of behavioral science. Again, this is very well-established science that we need explicit instruction in how the written code works. So, next one is that spelling instruction is not important because children can just use spell check. Unfortunately, this is just not going to work. So as we all know, anybody who has texted knows that spell check is imperfect, and it will change your words to words you definitely didn't mean to say, and that those spelling errors can really matter. They can matter in text, but they particularly matter in employment situations. Consistently misspelling things. There are so many words that spell check isn't going to catch. If you write loin instead of lion, spell check isn't going to catch that. That's a word, right? Choosing the wrong there, that's a word. It's not going to catch those kinds of things. And we know that proficiency in spelling actually supports reading development. So it's valuable in various ways. Additionally, we know that accurate spelling requires and reflects more advanced linguistic knowledge than accurate reading. That's because it requires the integration of phonological, orthographic, and morphological knowledge. So if we teach kids how to read, but don't teach them how to spell, we just dropped off as the task became harder, right? Spelling is harder than reading. It's a productive task as opposed to a recognition task. So it's harder, and we have to support that. Additionally, and very importantly, fluid automatic spelling that you don't have to think about allows cognitive resources to be devoted to the content of what we are trying to write. The more we have to focus on how to spell words, the less cognitive resources are available for thinking about what we're writing. And the fifth misconception I want to talk about is that handwriting instruction is not important because children will be typing everything. Also, this just isn't going to work. The attention to letter form that happens during handwriting instruction can really help children as they work to recognize the small differences between letters. Sometimes it's the direction of in PB, D, and Q. That's the same shape mostly, just flipped and turned and all these things. Handwriting, they do have different motor patterns, right? They're similar images, just moved, but the motor patterns are different. And learning those motor patterns can help really solidify those different letter shapes. Additionally, like with spelling, labored handwriting creates a drain on mental resources that is needed for higher level aspects of writing. If I'm struggling to form the letters, it's much harder for me to give my attention to spelling. And if I'm struggling with both of those things, it's much harder for me to give my attention to the content of what I'm writing. Additionally, activities like taking notes, taking tests, doing classroom work, and homework depend on efficient and automatic handwriting skills and legible handwriting. When children perceive handwriting to be arduous and slow, they may avoid writing, which may further compound difficulties with spelling and writing. My daughter did this, and I didn't have a clue she was doing it until she told me. She at some point she said that she was figuring out what the shortest sentence she could say was because she didn't want to do the handwriting. She came through school at a time when this belief was in play and they didn't teach handwriting explicitly. So she makes her letters some crazy ways, starting at the back of the letter, just all kinds of crazy stuff. It's inefficient. And it was arduous for her. So she was avoiding writing any more than was absolutely necessary, which then means she doesn't get as much practice, right? Handwriting in the earliest grades is linked to basic reading and spelling achievement. Attention to these linkages among handwriting, reading, and spelling skills can help to reinforce early achievement across these areas. So if we remember that we're constructing this interface between the visual and language systems, so everything we do to pay attention to those aspects, draw the child's attention, and notice things is going to be beneficial. And handwriting is one of the most valuable tools we have to draw attention to the visual components of our letters. And I'm going to finish up quickly here. I just wanted to present 3 of the kind of most valuable, the core of the science of reading, so that they are familiar to you and you can further investigate these things. The first is the simple view of reading. This is just explaining that reading comprehension, the ultimate goal of reading, really has 2 components. One is decoding, or the ability to read those individual words. That's the one where we have to construct that part of our brain. We're not born with that. The other half is the language comprehension. So once we decode it, we need to understand what those words mean, right? So both components are essential in order to be able to read. And the red box is the one where we have to create that interface in our brain. Scarborough's reading rope is another really well-established and just important idea and visual that we use in the science of reading, which these are the same 2 boxes I just showed in the simple view of reading. They're just kind of rearranged here. We have the language comprehension box and the word recognition box. It just divides each of those components up into some sub-skills that go into each, okay? I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go all into it, but I really encourage you to look more into this. And last but not least, structured literacy is what is has the evidence, the strongest evidence based for what is effective for helping children learn to read by creating that interface between the language and the visual system. It includes the evidence-based elements. What we're teaching is phonology, sound symbol relationships, syllables, morphology, syntax, and semantics, all the components of language. And how we are teaching it is that we are using we're using a curriculum that is systematic and cumulative. It's explicit. Kids aren't left to hopefully figure it out just by being exposed. And it's diagnostic. We're monitoring, what do you not know yet? Okay, let's deal with that. We're not letting things slide by. And we combine all of those things and to create effective reading instruction. And if anybody is interested in learning more about the science of reading, which I so hope you are, please, I'm sorry about my dog is barking. Please check out any of these resources. They're really valuable, or reach out to me if you are interested in some other resources. Thank you.
Gonna open this up when I get in here, sorry. Okay, are you seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to get into the visual system, and I'm going to reiterate some of the things that Katherine Mendez has already stated about the process. One specifically is about when things are harder, there's less cognitive resources to process what's going on. And the visual system is not just eyes. Most people think visual means just eyes. The visual system happens because your brain is taking the information from the eyeballs. The eyeballs are data receivers, data collectors, so they take it all in and they send all that information into the brain. The brain does some processing and voila, we have vision. But that's not the end of the story, because you have vision so that you can interact with the environment. There's also a motor component. It's not just the movement of the eyes, it's the movement of the body. What do we do with the visual system to control the rest of our body? So when we, excuse me, when we bring information in, we talk about in the field of optometry, we talk about the visual field. And that is the whole surrounding, the whole visual space around you. We've divided out for, in terms of understanding how vision is developed, into the left visual field and the right visual field. You can see the red side of the brain eyeball drawing is labeled as the left field, and the greenish blue is the right visual field. So the information from both eyes, there's an overlapping portion in the middle. The information from both eyes goes into the brain, and it crosses at something called the optic chiasm, and that's where the right and left information is divided, so that you end up with the right visual field information being processed in the left brain in the occipital lobe, and then the left visual field information being processed in the right brain in the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe. So it's a complex process to get the information in. So if there's any errors on the way to get the information in, again, that adds to the complexity of trying to understand what the information is. So it goes in through the eyes, travels through the optic nerve into the occipital lobe, and it doesn't stop there. At that point, the brain starts figuring out what is it in context to other things, how is it categorized? So you have that whole process of figuring out, shaping up the visual image. And then the brain's also consolidating visual information with other sensory information. So it's categorizing with respect to just vision, but then it's also collaborating with potentially auditory stimulus, potentially touch stimulus. So it's incorporating all of the pieces to really define that object that you're seeing. And then beyond that, you have to decide what you're going to do with the information. And that's where vision is one of the key components in interacting with your environment. So it's like a lot of things, it is a learned process. So there's a lot of things that as children develop from infant through toddler to early childhood phases, there are activities that will encourage them to develop these skills. So you have, if you have a child that's not exposed to a lot of different stimuli, then they may have a slower time of developing. So ultimately, vision exists so that it's one way of us having a way to interact with our environment. So the brain goes through this process to create this visual image, and then we can decide what we're going to do with that information. When this is an example to talk about visual acuity, because again, that's what a lot of people think of, and that's where the understanding of vision sometimes stops with some medical professionals, because they just don't have the background in all of the complexity of the visual system. When you or your child is evaluated for visual acuity, basically the numbers correlate to a certain size of print. So for example, 20/20 is our goal. That's what we would like everybody to be at. And that's basically the average visual acuity that the majority of people with good vision can get to. So whether that's with glasses correction or no glasses correction, 20/20 is kind of our aim. It's not the smallest level of detail that people are capable of, but it's the average of the smallest level of vision that people are capable of. So 20/20 correlates to a medicine bottle label. And then, for example, if somebody is classified in the legally blind category, that's going to be in the 2200 range. And that's going to be like some headlines and some larger print books. And you can see the font sizes correlated. So a 20/20 would be a 3 and you've been on Word document and making things small. Sometimes Word, you have to like keep going down. It doesn't actually have a 3. It usually stops around an 8 or a 6. So 3-point font is really tiny. Whereas when you come up to a 2200, that's 33-point font. So it's a significant difference, and it's quite a bit larger than the standard 12-point font that a lot of times things are placed in. And then just to be nerdy, in Outlook, if you have the standard Calibri font, it's 11 is your default font size. So that's going to come into like right around your 2060 size range. So that's just for reference. And then myopia, hyperopia, astigmatism, these are the technical words for what we call refractive conditions. And that means basically a glasses prescription. So for example, my glasses are because I have presbyopia, which is old eyes, meaning I need my reading glasses. If I don't have my reading glasses on, I struggle to read, everything's blurry and I'm really uncomfortable. But hyperopia, for example, that's the second label on the list, is where the eyeball is shorter than the focal length of the eye. So like light comes in through the front surface of the eye, and there's all these what we call media. So it's fluids that the light has to pass through in order to get to the back of the eye, and it's focused through the lens. If the focus point, the lens makes the focus point behind the eyeball, that's a hyperopic or a farsighted eye. If the lens makes the image focus in front of the back of the eye, that's a myopic or nearsighted eye. So farsighted, basically, you see better far away than you do up close, and nearsighted, you see better up close than you do far away. You can have astigmatism, which basically means when the light goes through the lens of the eye, it's kind of not really on the back of the eye, but the best focusing point may be in front of, maybe in back of. And there's actually two specific focusing points because of the shape of the eye. It's more, you'll hear football or egg shaped, and you get this kind of funky, there's two points, so that's just kind of all blurred. And that's what I'll describe to patients about. It's like the funhouse mirrors, so ones that stretch you out or squish you down. So that's the astigmatism. And you'll see these as, those are examples of how prescriptions will be written. So if you have one number in your prescription, you're either farsighted or nearsighted. If there's a plus in front of it, that's a farsighted prescription. If there's a minus in front of it, that's a nearsighted prescription. If you have three numbers, then that's in a prescription that has astigmatism in the prescription as well. And you can also see differences in the power, so the numbers, and we call that anisometropia. If there are significant differences in the power between the two eyes, it can affect how the brain takes in information. It could potentially lead to some other conditions, such as amblyopia, which is even with your best glasses, the eye still doesn't see that good. So refractive, meaning that it's caused by the glasses prescription, especially being different between the two eyes, or if there's a lot of astigmatism or a lot of nearsightedness or a lot of farsightedness. So when I get the glasses on, you both eyes just don't see that great, and have to get adapted into wearing the glasses for a while. Strabismic means an eye turn, and an eye turn can also cause reduced vision. So when we get into eye coordination is, again, it goes along the developmental timeline. Optokinetic nystagmus is that OKN, that's a reflex. So basically, if there is a series of moving targets, for example, I was riding a train one time with a colleague of mine, and we saw a bunch of trees, and she was like, "Oh, I'm watching your OKN." So basically your eyes will track until they can't go any further and jump back and continue to track moving objects. And fixation is, can I look at a target and hold my eyes still? Saccades are a point-to-point jump between the two eyes. You do that sideways, up and down, vertical. It doesn't really, there's no specific way that you have to do saccades. It's the ability to move your eyes from point to point, and generally that is stimulation driven. So if I hear a sound and I want to look at it, I don't necessarily have to move my whole self. I can move my eyes to where the sound is located. Smooth pursuit, so there's a bird flying past me. I can put my eyes on that bird and follow that bird as it goes along. And then visually directed reaching, and that's a visual motor. So again, you're incorporating the body. So if I want to, for example, reach out and touch the mouse on my computer, I have a sense of like where to stop my hand, so I'm not jamming into it. Sorry, I go back. Sorry about that. So with all of those are kind of a foundation baseline, and then you have your set points of where the eyes sit, which is your eye alignment. So all of the eye movements are based on where your eyes sit and rest. So in the rest position, if they're lined up, we call that ortho is our technical term. There could be an inward eye turn or an ESO. There could be an outward or an exo posture. There could be a hyper or a hypo, which means that the eyes don't sit vertically aligned. And these can be atropia, which means when I look at somebody and their eye is turned, you would see it. That's called atropia. But if I look at somebody and their eyes look like they're lined up, but when I cover one eye, it goes to its rest position, which is either out, in, up, or down, then they have what's called aphoria, which means it's kind of like they're holding it together, but if challenged, then their eye alignment degrades. So these are all things that if there's errors in any of these, it's going to cause errors in getting the information in. Any errors in getting the visual information in are going to make it harder, again, to process the visual information. And again, as Katherine related to you, is that anything that makes it harder means that the cognitive resources aren't there to support being good at the task. So you need this underlying visual foundation to even support getting to the place where Katherine is talking about, where now you're going to have the exposure and the repetition. So if you're not even getting to that point, all of your if your visual information is bad, all of your foundation is going to be unstable. So the other component of vision, so that part that we just talked about is kind of the visual skills, the foundation visual skills, and then the what does your brain do with it, the visual processing. So that first part has to be foundational, has to be solid for a person to have good visual information processing. And this relates to, again, we talked about it's the body sense and the understanding of space, that you have laterality and directionality is understanding there's two halves of my body, and then we label them as left and right, which eventually becomes automatic for a person because you hear it lots and lots and lots, left, right, left, right. And I think that I just did that backwards because I'm little unstable on that one, but the laterality and directionality also builds into letter recognition, because if you're unstable in your sense of laterality and directionality with self, as you project that into space, that can be unstable, and you could have an unstable ability to recognize the direction, for example, of those BD, Ps, and Qs, which all look alike in certain fonts. Another key component with laterality, directionality, and letter recognition is spatial relations. Our brains are wired to look at an object. For example, those B's, D's, P's, and Q's, they all kind of look the same. And my brain is wired to think that, oh, it's the same thing, it's just turned a different way. So if it wasn't with respect to language, where I'm looking at the form, and in context, I'm looking at POP as pop, versus DOD is dot, and like, okay, that doesn't make sense. So my brain's going to contextually kind of put that together because of those learned things that Katherine talked about in her presentation. So if spatial relations is unstable, they wouldn't even have the ability to recognize that they're kind of the same thing. So you would have to start with getting the spatial relations more stable before they could make that next step into understanding that letter when you apply context is a specific letter. So other components of visual information processing are discrimination, memory, form constancy, sequential memory, figure ground, and closure. And you will see corollaries to this in what Dr. Moncrieff is going to present. There's a significant amount of integration between the visual system and the auditory system. Part of that is these are key ways that we interact with our environment, and they really do link together into like help us understand the whole of what's going on around us. So again, why do we have vision? We have vision so we can interact with the environment. Vision is key in balance and movement. So vision, proprioception, and vestibular inputs all have to kind of match up. Proprioceptive is that sense of muscle feedback. So it plays into our visual motor coordination and that motor memory. And some of the things that Dr. Mendez was talking about with respect to when we write and that handwriting and generating the muscle memory. So that's a visually guided movement. So again, you need vision to do those things. We talk about depth perception and spatial localization. Depth perception is that fine, two-eye, detailed, how close things are together in terms of like height. So if something is coming closer to you. Spatial localization is generally how far do I think something is away from me, and can I judge that? Can I walk to it? Can I reach my hand out to shake hands with somebody and accurately land in the range of their hand? So that's the difference between depth perception and spatial localization. And those are important also as you engage with the environment, and it helps to flesh out the whole picture. I believe that is my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing.
So now I'm going to start sharing my slides here with the auditory system. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about is the auditory system, and to tie in with what Katherine said and Melissa said, what we're hoping to convey here today is that where we are in the world is right now we're testing all of the children in elementary schools for their ability to hear beeps and to see the shapes of letters and identify them in the right size. So we're basically doing some measure of screening children for basic auditory and visual problems. But I hope from what Dr. Zarn just explained, you can understand that there's so much more to being able to see the letters that make up our orthography. and to be able to utilize those letters in a way to develop reading skills. And I'm going to share with you how that same thing is true in the auditory system. And then, as Anasa Franklin said at the beginning, even our screening methods aren't really doing what we're supposed to be doing. So we're really falling short for a lot of these children. So I'm going to bring back Katherine's reading rope, because I pulled it into my slides at the last minute here, because I want to point out here word recognition. This is where we are talking today, is looking at the phonological sounds of the letters and to be able to decode them and to recognize those letters orthographically as well as phonologically. These are the basic components of auditory and visual processing that are so critically important in young children to build those skills and to give them the capacity to start learning to read. And the learning triangle of reading is that it requires auditory, vision, and motor skills. So, you know, as Katherine said, writing is very important because it brings in the motor skills that are so critically important to integrate what it is that we're hearing and seeing. So I'm going to talk now about the auditory components, being able to register those sounds that create an awareness of our sounds that make up our language, but also where they are in the world around us. And then to alert us to different sounds so that we can establish salience, which sounds are important to us as opposed to just sort of background. And then incorporating the rhythm of the sounds in a way that builds prosody. So when we're reading, to get the important comprehension that we need, we have to not just plow through each word one after the next, but we have to string them together in a meaningful way. And so that's part of that rhythm. This is all foundational, important information for literacy. So we start with the 2 ears, and you know, I think I say this 100,000 times. We test 1 ear at a time, and we do a really good job of testing 1 ear at a time, and then we send our patients out, and we never think about what are the 2 ears actually doing together. And of course, the 2 ears have to bring the information in from the outside and then integrate them in the brain so that we can then develop words and be able to understand what it is that we're hearing. So sounds come in from all around us. They come into our ears, and they are first coded within the cochlea. So that's the part we test when we ask somebody to raise your hand or push a button when you hear a beep. So we test one cochlea, and then we test the other cochlea, and we tell everybody, you hear just fine. And then we don't think about, well, what happens when those sounds come into the cochlea and then go up into the brainstem, where for the first time, the sounds are actually going to be brought together from the right side and the left side, and we have to do some type of binaural processing of those sounds. And we have to make sense out of what did we hear from the right side and what did we hear from the left side. And then finally, those sounds go up into our cortex. And on my brain, it looks like the sounds from one side go up to one part of the cortex, and from the other side, it goes up to the other. And that's what Dr. Zarn was saying about the visual system. So I threw her slide back in here, because I think what's really important, this is really nice. Notice here how, yes, the left eye goes to the right side and the right eye goes to the left, but there's an integration across the middle. I love the color here, because it shows that we don't just have the right hemisphere doing one thing and the left hemisphere doing the other. There's this constant interplay, so that the sounds that are integrated in the brainstem then continue being integrated all the way up through the remaining ascending system and in the cortex. So hearing versus processing. Hearing is what we test when we do a hearing test. And right now, federal and state laws mandate that every child in elementary school be screened for their hearing and their vision. But as Anasa so poignantly pointed out, that doesn't work so well, because a lot of times they do hearing screenings in very loud environments, or they have people who are doing the screening who don't really know what they're doing. And then if the child fails, then there's no real follow-up. How do we find out if the child really does need to be evaluated for a hearing problem? And of course, if there's an acuity problem, either in the auditory system or the visual system, that's the first step in having a major processing problem, because you've got to get that fixed first. But once we fix the acuity, then we should really be looking beyond acuity and thinking about how the child is actually utilizing those sounds and those sights, and being able to integrate the sounds from both ears and the sights from both eyes to make something meaningful about what they're hearing and seeing. We have no requirement, None, period, whatsoever, for any kind of processing, screening, or evaluation for children in preschool or in elementary school. So this is one of my passions here, is to promote the notion that we need to start doing this, which is why we're doing a project here in Memphis with Dr. Zarn and our graduate students. We're actually doing that now. We're testing kids to see what their vision and auditory processing skills are. So this is really important because we want to find out if these first and second and third graders really can make out what they're hearing and seeing and work with those signals as effectively as they should be. So this is just an example of some of the kinds of things that we do in the auditory domain to give you a sense of, this is not just raising your hand when you hear a beep. So this is basically asking, can you identify this word?
Inkwell, armchair.
So now you can see those are 2-syllable words, really clear, easy to understand. But if you present those to some children, they may not understand them. So that's just a very simple test. Now here's one where you're hearing words with background noise.
Say the word chair.
And you might have thought, oh, I think I heard what that one was, but now try this one. When the noise gets louder, the discrimination goes down. How about if you have a memory test? Can you remember what you heard?
1, 4, 10, 2, 5, 9, 6, 8.
Repeat back all those numbers. And then what happens if you put a one word in one ear and another word in another ear, and you say, okay, tell me everything you hear?
Will,
plane,
gas,
sand,
bed,
rose,
Now, some of those you probably could make out. Hint, you were hearing it through one speaker. When we test kids, one word's coming into one earphone, the other word's coming into the other. So it's a little easier because the head is a nice intervening factor.
Say the word
Oops,
chair.
sorry.
Inkwell,
I gotta get past these.
4, 10,
sand,
bed,
rose,
armchair,
That's what it's like in a classroom. So common symptoms that we see in kids who have processing problems. They may say, I can work okay when I'm in a quiet place, but I have a really hard time when I'm in a noisy place, and they start to get very active in noisy places, and they're very distracted by noises. But even some of the kids who have processing problems are the ones who also can't do well even in quiet, because it doesn't matter that there's noise. They still have a hard time sorting out the signals that are coming into their ears. They may have a hard time following conversations, even when it's nice and quiet. You give them directions. We hear this all the time from parents. They can do one thing, but if I tell them 3 things, they can't remember the second or the third. They're disorganized and they forget what they're told. And they often make substitutions. So the example that Katherine made about lion and loin, these are the kinds of things where kids who have a hard time sounding out words will try to memorize the letters. And so when they write the word, they put the letters in the wrong order. They've got the right letters, but they're in the wrong order. And so they make these kinds of errors all the time. And then they struggle with spelling and writing and reading because of all the things that we've been talking about this morning. So the big bottom line here is you've got a child who is struggling in school or struggling to do the kinds of things that you would expect a child at that age to be able to do. What do you do if you have concerns about these things? And unfortunately, in too many places in the country, there are no resources available to even have these things evaluated. And there are no opportunities in the preschool or in elementary schools for these kinds of processing skills to be evaluated. So what we're hoping to do is to promote the idea that these are skills that should be evaluated. But the good news is that if you are in the Memphis area, and then for any of you who are watching our webinar from other regions in the country or outside, we urge you to get in touch with us and take our resources, take our methods, and please use them to develop these kinds of processing evaluations in your area as well. So, but if you are here, the auditory processing and vestibular concerns can be evaluated at the Memphis Speech and Hearing Center, which is part of our School of Communication Science and Disorders. And if you're concerned about visual processing, the Southern College of Optometry, where Dr. Zarn is, will be more than happy to evaluate and find out if there's anything we can do. And the bottom line, here's the best news of all. These are treatable processing problems. Both of these, whether they're in the visual domain or in the auditory domain, there are short-term treatments that are available that can actually remediate these and make them better. We don't think everybody in school who struggles has these problems. That's really important to say. There are lots of reasons that kids don't do well with literacy and learning. But if they have these problems and we can identify them, then just as if we are identifying a hearing loss or a vision loss, we want to remediate them. We want to make it easier for these kids, to make more resources available for them to do really well in school. So then those are Katherine's references for her literacy. And I think that is the end of our presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Moncrieff. Everybody did a tremendous job. I'd like to thank Ms. Franklin, Ms. Mendez, Dr. Moncrieff, Dr. Zarn. We have a few minutes left for questions. If there's any questions in the question and answer box, I see something in the chat. Looking forward to the presentation on amblyoptia. Since in the VA, it can be acquired through head trauma. Any questions for our speakers?
Yeah, that's right. If you're watching this webinar and you're interested in the one on Thursday, that will be just on the topic of the auditory processing disorder of amblyoptia, and that comment is exactly right. What we're really concerned with is that this is a major problem with children and learning, but in acquired disorders, things that are the result of disease processes or head trauma, there's all kinds of problems in the adult population as well.
And if anyone wants the recording and the PowerPoint, Rami indicated it'll be on the FIT SPH website, and it's listed there in the chat, www.memphis.edu/fedex/event/telehealth.php. So any other questions or any other comments?
There's a Q&A about referring a child for an assessment. And I think Katherine's responding to it. I just wanted to say for one consideration is that I've tried to get my kiddo in for hearing evaluation at the Memphis Speech and Hearing Clinic. Just understanding what your insurance is, way that's set up. And whether or not you need to have a pediatrician referral. And Anasa referred to that in the beginning, that's why she's like shaking her head really firmly here. So your insurance may dictate how the referral goes in, but you can certainly contact either the Memphis Speech and Hearing Clinic or Southern College of Optometry to set up, like trying to get that established. And the people that set up the appointments, you can ask them about the insurance question if they need to have the referral from the pediatrician. For visual information processing evaluations, we typically have so if your child's had a comprehensive eye exam, which is your annual eye exam, we ask for those records to be sent if they weren't done at our school.
Any of our panelists want to say some final remarks?
There's another Q&A. Do you have suggestions for earlier intervention screening children for auditory processing? Debbie, I'll read that one for you. Often, I believe these tests are done when children are older because the test can be more challenging for younger children, but many children start to learn how to read at younger ages, so may fall through the cracks earlier on.
Thank you so much, Jenna Marie. That's a really important question, because right now, unfortunately, the binaural activation in the brain that we depend upon to do our auditory processing evaluations really isn't fully mature until age 5 or 6. That's why we've been waiting until kids get to be that age before we really start to assess them. But we are working here on some electrophys methods to try to identify some of the biomarkers, if you will, that could be present in younger children. And then together with one of my colleagues here in the school, we're developing a new a new type of masking level difference test for kids. It's called the Huggins unmasked melodies. It's using the concepts of the psychoacoustic concepts of Huggins pitch. And we're hoping that we can even test kids down to around 3 to start to show this inability of the binaural system to show the release from masking by having them identify familiar melodies through picture pointing. So we're working very hard to try to get some new tests that would be appropriate for kids who are younger than 5 or 6. But right now we're kind of stuck with that. But actually, many people won't even test them until they're 7. We will test them at 5.
Well, I think our time is up. We really want to thank our speakers. This has been a really tremendous discussion, eye-opening, and one that's very important to literacy for all of us. So thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.